Hello and welcome back to another NoCode.tech tutorial. My name is Niall Frater, and in this video I'm going to be telling you all about APIs. Specifically, we're going to learn what an API is, understand how they work, and then we're going to take it practical by building a translation app powered by APIs on a platform called Retool. Now let's go into a little bit more detail about what we're going to learn. So, as I mentioned, first of all, we have this platform called Retool. Now, usually this platform, it's super powerful, and so it's typically used by actual programmers, people who can code. And we're going to learn how to actually use and leverage this tool, but without having to, spend months and months learning technical concepts. In other words, we're going to keep it as non-technical as possible. And that means we're going to dive not just into Retool, but also into APIs. You're going to learn when you use APIs, how you can use APIs, where you can find them, what an API even is. And so we're going to dive into all of that, again, in a non-technical way, and then we're going to take it practical. So in the last video in this series, you're actually going to be using an API called Electro Translation. It works a little bit like Google Translate, and we're going to be using that to build an app live on Retool. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind while you're watching this video, APIs are one of the most powerful tools in any no-coder's belt. But it's worth keeping in mind, they're probably the closest you're going to get to the actual tech world. These APIs are usually built for programmers, but thankfully we now live in a time where no-code tools are available, no-code knowledge is available, and we can now approach it in a non-technical way. But it will seem a little bit daunting, it will seem a bit intimidating, but as with every other NoCode.tech video, we're endeavouring to do this just in the most non-technical, simplest, easiest way we can. And one thing to keep in mind, I'll mention this as we go through the video, but there are, for almost every topic that we discuss, there are other videos that you can watch in our library that will give you more in-depth information, that will let you kind of understand the ins and outs. In this video, the main thing we want to get out of this is showing you the Retool platform and how to actually build an app on it. So we're going to whiz through the theories of APIs as quickly as we can, but it's still a tricky concept, so it's worth just taking the time and making sure you fully understand it. But anyway, let's actually start by figuring out what an API is. So an API stands for an Application Programming Interface, and it's really just a fancy way of saying a language that computers can use to communicate. Now, don't bother writing down Application Programming Interface or worrying too much about that. That is probably the last time that you will hear me using that full phrase. Because the good news is, if we're trying to keep it non-technical, we don't really have to worry about that at all. So, how does an API work? Well, it's a little bit like a pipe that you can use to access another company, another company's data or services. So let's say you're building an app, you want to use some sort of data held by someone else. You can almost build an imaginary pipe or virtual pipe between your app and their services, their data, their database, and take data from it. And that is what we call an API. Now, one of the interesting things about APIs is there's lots of different APIs out there, but once you learn how to use one, you kind of know how to use all of them. And that's because they all follow a kind of common language or a common set of rules called REST. Now, don't worry too much about what REST actually stands for. I've been in the API world now myself for about 10 years, and I think I've used the full phrase maybe twice ever. So it's not something you need to bother learning, but just know that you have these certain type of APIs called REST APIs, which is almost every API out there today. And once you know one, they all kind of work the same way. And we'll get into those rules and those standards pretty soon. But one thing to keep in mind, almost every internet company that you can think of uses APIs. Deliveroo, DoorDash, Uber, Netflix, Facebook, Amazon, all of these companies, they all have APIs available that you can use. And they do different things related to whatever that company does. So for example, with Amazon, there's an API that you can use to get all the information about all the products that they offer and that they sell people. And you can go and look up things like, what kind of super soakers do they sell? What kind of, car mats do they sell? Literally anything. It can go on infinitely. But let's look at an actual concrete example. Now, I am betting that you have used an API before called Sign In with Facebook. And if you haven't used that one, I'm betting you've used Sign In with Google, Sign In with Twitter, or one of these. And if you've not used it, surely you've seen it. And so if you haven't, you'll notice on the right hand side here I've got this little image. It's from a marketplace website called Etsy, quite a big popular website as well. You might have used Etsy. And when you try to register or sign into Etsy, you get this little box that shows up here, and you've got the option to either continue with Facebook or continue with Google. And so the thing that's really interesting here is when you click one of those buttons, you don't actually know this, but when you click one of those buttons, you're really using an API. And so when you click that Facebook button, Facebook is allowing the company, so let's say Etsy, we'll use Etsy as an example. When you go into Etsy and click continue with Facebook, Facebook is letting Etsy access its database, check if your email address or your Facebook account actually exists, and if it does, Facebook is then saying, okay, with the user's permission, we'll tell you their name, here's a photo of them, here's their email address, and yes, we can confirm, we do know who they are who they say they are. And this is pretty important, right? Because what's really happening is you're putting your email in, Facebook are checking that against their database and they're going, yep, john.smith@gmail.com, that looks correct to us, we're happy with that, that user is a Facebook user, and they're telling that information to Etsy. And Etsy is then saying, well, Facebook says you're good, and if you're good with Facebook, you're good with me, and therefore I'm going to let you log in and create an account. And that's, in really, really simple terms, kind of how the API works. Of course, it's a lot more secure, it's a lot more technical, people cannot use APIs to steal your information, and it's worth bearing in mind you're using APIs every single day. Depending on how you're watching this video, there's probably an API involved with that as well. They are everywhere, and as we go through this, you'll kind of start to understand why and how that is. So we should probably understand now in a little bit more slightly technical detail about how an API actually works. And probably the best thing to liken an API to is a phone call. So think about this and watch some of the wording that I've put in the slide here. When you make a phone call, you're dialing a specific number to reach a specific person. You're going to give that person information, and you're going to expect a response back with some further information that you desire. So, for example, you phone up a flower shop and say, do you have any red roses in stock? And they're either going to say, yes, we do, or no, we don't. So let's see how that actually maps to an API. Now, similar, we're going to kind of use not quite a florist, but a restaurant example, and stick to a phone call. So imagine you're phoning a restaurant, right? The first thing that you have to do before you even phone them is you have to go find their phone number. Maybe you're looking up the phone book, maybe you've had a menu through the door, or maybe you're just simply going on Google like the rest of us and, Googling the restaurant that you want to go to, grabbing the phone number. But you know that you have to get a specific number to reach a specific place. Really basic, of course. An API is really, really similar. Every API has a specific URL. The same way that you go to google.com to get google.com to load on your browser. Similarly, an API might go to api.google.com if you want to access Google's APIs. I'll show you an example of that in a wee minute and it'll make a little bit more sense. But for now, keep in mind, every API has a specific address that you have to go to in order to make that API work. Now, obviously, you have to actually phone them. And, that phone call in API terms is called a GET request. So you are phoning someone to get some specific information. And of course, when they answer the phone, you're going to ask them for some sort of information. So take the example we've got here. We've phoned up, which is our GET request. And the request we are specifically making is, hi there, what time is your restaurant open until? And of course, the person on the other end of the line, the waiter, waitress, whoever, they're going to reply, we're open until 10 p.m. Brilliant. So we've just made a request for information, what time you open to, and we've received an expected reliable response, 10 p.m. So what do we mean by that expected part? Well, this is pretty important. If you think about it, right, if you want to implement an API into some sort of software or app that you are building, you have to have some idea of what the API is going to say back to you before you actually implement it. So if I've got a restaurant booking API and I know that I want to, implement that in my software and I want to say what time you open to, I kind of need to know, is the restaurant API going to reply with something I would expect, like 10 p.m, or is it going to reply with, oh, we're going to shut after sunset tonight, And that's pretty important to know, because that then dictates how you're going to build your app. Based on what information you get back from an API, You have to then decide, what am I going to show the user? What actions will the user be able to take with that information? So on and so forth. The good news is you don't have to work this out for yourself. Every single API has what we call documentation, and that documentation explains exactly what format your request needs to be in. So how do you ask for the information, and then how you're going to receive that information back, what the response is going to be. So keep that in mind, but let's go into a little bit more detail and try something that's slightly more complicated. So let's imagine that we're going to give slightly more instructive information. This time we're going to phone up and we're going to request that the restaurant books us into a table for 2 at 8 p.m. So as you can kind of see here, you call, you make your request, and we have several pieces of information in mind. Number one, the time that we want the booking for, and number two, the number of guests that we're going to bring. So let's say I'm going out, me and my girlfriend, we want a table for 2, that sort of thing. Now here's the important bit. In an API, whenever you make a request, you always have to give some sort of supplementary information. In the same way you would in a phone call, if I want to use a restaurant booking API and do it over computer, then there's some information that I have to give. I have to specify, type in 8 p.m, I have to type in the number of guests, maybe I have to type in dietary requirements, something like that. When you do this with an API, we call these parameters. So a parameter is just some sort of piece of data that you give to an API to help that API process and properly execute your request. And so there's one key thing to keep in mind here. We've sent 2 pretty clear parameters over: number of guests, booking time. But you can't really, if you think about an actual phone call, right, you can't really make a booking without giving your name, because otherwise the restaurant doesn't know who you are. So for example, if you turn up and you've not made a booking and you say, oh, hi, I'm here, I'm Mr. Smith. Well, they don't have Mr. Smith down because you didn't give them your name, so how are they going to know? And even worse, if you were phoning, say, a private members club and you weren't a member of that club, and you did, if they don't have your name down, then you're obviously not going to get in. What exactly am I talking about? Let me show you. So APIs have a similar system of identification and authentication. So identification being, who are you? And then authentication being, are you allowed to do something? So, in the real world, we use names and we use phone numbers to know who each other are. But in APIs, when you sign up for an API, so when you go on api.google.com and you say, I want to sign up for this Google API for searching all the information, Google or Netflix or Facebook or whoever it is website that you sign up to, or whoever it is API you sign up to, they are going to give you something called an API key. And this is just a big long list of numbers and letters. You just copy and paste it, you put it into whatever you're using to build APIs, and you'll see that soon. But you put that in there, and then every time you send an API request, and you have to make sure every time that you include that, then the API knows who you are and it knows what you are and are not allowed to do. Now think about our sign in with Facebook example. An API key is how you make sure that only people who are authorized to sign in with Facebook and who are authorized to kind of download information about users, that's how you do it with an API key, because they provide their unique secret API key and you know that they are who they say they are. So, as the primary way that APIs are secured, there are other ways to do it, but you'll see these a lot. And one thing to really, really keep in mind is do not ever let anyone else ever see your API key. It's a little bit like a password, but the difference is, when you change your password, it's pretty easy. You just get an email, click a link, done. When you change an API key, you have to go back through all your API calls, all your requests that you've made, and change your API key. So don't ever do that, because if someone has your API key, they can make API calls pretending they're you, and they can steal your data or get you into a load of trouble. So that's the one rule. So let's talk about requests and responses. So all APIs have a specific, unique set of requests and responses, a little bit like what we talked earlier. So when you phone a restaurant, realistically, there are only several things you can ask. Now, you can phone them up and ask them to do math questions for you, or you can, phone them up and ask them what the capital of Thailand is, but you don't reasonably expect an answer. That's not a reasonable question to ask a restaurant. What is reasonable is, what time are you open until? What kind of food do you serve? What's your dress code? What's in the menu? What's this? So on and so forth. Those are the kind of questions that you do expect to request of a restaurant. Now, an API works by a similar request and response system. You send a very specific request to the API that you already know is a reasonable thing to request of it, and it responds with requested information. And as we said earlier, that information would always also be expected to be reliable and robust information. And so let's go back to this idea of documentation. We mentioned this earlier, but every API out there has documentation, and you can think of this mostly as an instruction manual. You know, in the same way that if you buy furniture from IKEA, you get a little manual telling you how to build it. Every API has the same thing. You can normally find an API's documentation on its website, and quite often, if you want to, use an API, quite often there's several different competitors available. So, for example, we're going to use translation. Today, we're going to use Lecto translation, but you could equally use Google Translate, Microsoft Translate, etc., etc. And so quite often what you'll do is you'll go to those websites, you'll look up the documentation for the API, and you'll figure out some questions like, does it do the requests that I want it to do? Does it look easy to use? Do I understand the data, the parameters that it wants? So on and so forth. The important thing here is this sort of tells you what you will and won't get from a request. And as I've mentioned here, Facebook's API will probably happily give you a list of every user that you follow if you authenticate with your account. But what it's not going to do is start letting you, into its database to read private messages or, see people's photos or see their date of birth or any other kind of, information. So, these aren't some sort of secret door into a company's database. They do rigorously control what you can and cannot access, in the same way that if you go on facebook.com and log in with your account, you can't start accessing other people's private messages or personal information either. So something to keep in mind whenever you actually want to understand these, check out the documentation. Now, we're going to get a little bit more technical, and again, bear with me here, we'll try and keep it as simple as we can, but we're going to explain get and post. These are two different types of API requests. So take a little look at the sort of table that I have here. So, when you use an API, usually there are 4 different actions that you might want to take. You might want to find out a piece of data, which we call a get request. So for example, what time is the restaurant open to? Let's go and get the restaurant opening times. The next thing you might want to do, which we call a post, is you might want to create a piece of data. Now this is quite an ambiguous phrase, but let me look at the example I've given you here. So, let's say you want to phone and make a new table reservation. Then actually you're creating a piece of data. Because if you think about it, you are taking something in the restaurant and you're adding to it. So where there was no booking before, you have now added a booking. The waiter's actually in it into a computer and typed in your name and the time of the booking and so on and so forth. You have a booking, you've created data. So we call that post, and get and post are the 2 most important. We're pulling this stat out of nowhere, but roughly 90% plus of API calls almost always use get and post. It's very, very rare to see anything else. But the other 2 that you might see hanging about are put. So put is when you want to edit a piece of data. So let's say you phone and change the booking that you've made. Or you also get delete, which, as the name suggests, is simply deleting a piece of data. Now, if you want to understand this concept in a little bit more detail, this might sound quite limited, but actually these 4 actions can let you do almost anything that you want in an app. And we have this odd term that we use for it called CRUD. It stands for create a piece of data, read a piece of data, update a piece of data, or edit it, or delete a piece of data. So we call that CRUD methodology. We do have a whole video on this if you want to understand it in more detail. It's a really, really powerful way to build apps, and so it's worth checking into that as well. And of course, bearing in mind that these are pretty technical terms. So again, we have a video called Introduction to APIs as part of our APIs Fundamentals course. And again, you'll find that linked below. But if you're struggling to follow along a wee bit, if you'd like some more information, some better explanations, check that out as well. But let's forget those for now. As I say, let's just focus on get and post, forget, delete, and put. So I just want to go through these in a wee bit more information, make sure you understand them, because in the next video we're going to be actually making use of them. So a GET request is called a GET request because you are getting a piece of information from an API. You know, in the same way that you might say to your wife, oh look, I'm going to get a loaf of bread from the shop. You know, in that same way, you are getting information from an API. You're getting something. On the other hand, a post request is a bit like posting a letter to a person. That's not quite what post means, but you know, it's a good way to think about it. You're posting something, you're sending something. So you know, let's say you've got some piece of information. Maybe you want to send a letter to your husband or a family member or something, or you know, a government department. Then you've got some piece of information. You want a person to receive, and you are going to send it to them. You're going to post it to them. So just think of post as being synonymous with send. And then importantly, one thing to keep in mind here, and this is one of the rules, a GET request will never change the information being supplied by the API. What do I mean by that? Well, if you phone a restaurant and you ask what time they close and they tell you 8 p.m, and then I phone the same restaurant 2 minutes later and ask the same question, they're not going to tell me 10 p.m. They're going to tell me 8 p.m, the same thing they told you. And no matter how many people phone and ask what time do you close or what's in the menu, those people are always going to get the same answer because they are simply getting information. They're not changing information. On the other hand, if you phone and book a table for 8 p.m, and then I phone and try to book a table for 8 p.m, well, you've just taken the table, so I'm not going to be able to do that. And so, you know, asking for the time does not change the data on the API. You know, doing a GET request, but posting data to an API, that will always change the API. So whenever you post something, it does create some permanent change in data on an API. Really important rule to keep in mind because it also dictates what requests are GET and what requests are POST. But again, you'll find all that in any API's documentation. And so, you know, there's a lot of different other technical factors that differentiate these. I mean, GET and POST, if you go and do computer science at university or college, there are you know, full lectures and lessons dedicated just to these two concepts. But there's just two things, two factors or two key pieces of information that I want you to keep in mind because these are important if you're ever building with APIs, which you probably will be. So first of all, a GET request is not encrypted. And what I mean by that is a really determined hacker could find out any information that you send in a GET request. You know, if I book a restaurant for a restaurant booking API and I say 8 p.m, a really determined hacker could find out that I am going to be at that restaurant at 8 p.m. So you would only ever ask for information. You know, a hacker doesn't really care if I've phoned up and sort of said, oh, what time do you close? But they might care if they know I'm going to be in a certain place at a certain time. With that said, right, it's still incredibly hard. I do not mean this is trivial in any way, but if you're building something truly secure, it's worth bearing in mind, is it okay if a hacker finds it or not? Probably not. With that said, when you make a GET request, the information is not encrypted, but when you receive a response, the response is encrypted. Let me give you an example of that. Let's say I go to my doctor's office and I request my medical records. A hacker can find out that I requested my medical records, but when they give me those medical records, they respond with the medical records, a hacker cannot access those medical records. And so when you're designing an app and you're using an API, it's worth thinking about, you know, what information do you want to be semi-public, you know, in the sense of, do I want the world to find out that I've requested my medical records? Probably not, but it's also not the end of the world if people know I've simply asked for my medical records. It's really not a big deal. What would be a big deal is if the whole world could see my medical records. That'd be a huge deal. That'd be a big problem. So it's something to bear in mind when you're designing apps. You know, what sort of information is okay to be seen by an unintended person and what isn't. However, the good news is a post request is always encrypted. So anything you send via a post request, 100% all the time, is always encrypted. A hacker, doesn't matter how determined they are, unless they have invented quantum computing, they cannot see that information or read it. You know, anything that you've sent via post request, anything that you've received. And so I'll let you in on a little secret. every time you log into pretty much any website ever, even if it's not using, Facebook's API or Google's API, even if it's just their own setup, almost always when you log in, your password is being sent over a post request. Every website in the world does this. And so, to me, that is proof enough that the tech community considers this a secure method. So if you're ever logging something in, handling sensitive information, credit card information, personal information, anything like that, you should always send it with a post request, because then it's safe, So pretty simple rule to follow. That is number one. And then number two, you maybe are wondering after that, why would you ever send information over a GET request at all? I mean, surely isn't it just better to make sure everything's safe rather than be sorry? So let me explain that in a little bit more detail. When you make an API request, you always have to specify some sort of information. So it's not that you want to use a GET request to send any kind of personal information. Of course you don't. But it's more like a GET request is when you want to just get something innocuous, something that has no real need for privacy or anything like that. So if I want to go to Amazon Shopping API, and let's say I want to find out the price of a bucket and a mop, then when I call Amazon Shopping API, I kind of have to put in a parameter that says, okay, the item I'm looking for is a bucket, and maybe I'll put some extra information in there, like, oh, the price that I want to pay is between $5 and $20 or something. It could be whatever you want, but you need to include some sort of information, non-sensitive information, in order for that Amazon API to do what it needs to do. On the other hand, though, if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to use the same API to buy the bucket and the mop, I would use a post request to instruct this, because again, I don't really want anyone seeing my Amazon login, my credit card or debit card details, so on and so forth. So those are two rules to keep in mind, just the difference between GET and POST. But bear in mind, every API does come with documentation, so don't worry about trying to work it out in your head. Should I use GET? Should I use GET? Should I use POST? The documentation will tell you exactly what to use. I just think it's worth knowing the rules between them both. There's one more little concept that I want to talk you through. It's slightly technical. We cover it in other videos, so I'll run over it here. But if you do need more information, then check out a video on data types underneath our database fundamentals series. Again, we'll link it on the description. But let's just cover this because it comes up quite a lot. So an array is it's a type of data. So a type of data might be a piece of text that could say hello there, or a piece of data could be a number such as your date of birth, or so on and so forth. But an array is a different type of data, and it's essentially a list. And the important thing about this list is everything is in it in a numbered order. And by the way, that order starts at 0 rather than 1. So you can think of it as just a list of things. And I've given an example here of a shopping list. So you could have an array called ingredients, and then that could be like number 1 basil, number 2 tomatoes, number 3 dough, so on and so forth. And so that data is just storing a number of items, a number of things in a numbered order. And so the important part to keep in mind, if you look in the bottom right hand corner there, I've written down what an array would actually look like. So if you were on a no-code platform typing in an array, you wouldn't just simply write 1 basil, 2 tomatoes, so on and so forth. Actually, what you would do is you would open a square bracket, like I've got there. You would put in the word basil, then you would do comma, then tomatoes, and comma, then dough. And the order that you put them in, the array will then number them. So it will be basil, tomato, dough, so on and so forth. Now the thing to keep in mind, I haven't put it on here just to catch you out, but an array always starts at 0. If you're writing a list and a shopping list, you're almost always going to start with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But as you know, computers usually work in zeros and ones. If you really dial down everything you're seeing on your screen right down to the processor, it's simply 0, 1, 0, 1, so on and so forth. And so, as a result, the way computers work is every list starts at 0. So 0 is a computer's equivalent of 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. Don't worry too much about trying to get your head around that. I'm going to show you a more practical example shortly. We'll actually type one in and you'll see how it works and you'll start to get a feel for it. And to be honest, you don't even really have to understand why a 1 is replaced with a 0. Again, we're trying to keep this non-technical. We'll let programmers go and worry about why that is. We simply just need to bear in mind a list starts at 0 and not 1. But this is an array. I just want to show you really quickly because we are going to use one in a different video. But bear in mind, if you do want to find out some more information about it, then check out our data types video. And with that in mind, I'll show you one more example just to sort of solidify it. So imagine you had a little book called Cars for Dummies, for example, as I've done here, and it's got a table of contents where you can imagine this is what the array would look like. You might have a page, what is a car, then a chapter I should say, what's a car, another chapter, what is driving, how does that work, another chapter around about sedans versus SUVs, the rules of the road that you must follow when you're driving with other people, so on and so forth. And so, you're probably pretty familiar with how a table of contents works. But if this was an array, and it kind of is, in programming talk, if your table of contents was an array, then the first chapter would be 0. It would start at chapter 0, then it would be chapter 1, chapter 2, so on and so forth. But this piece of information, what you are looking at here, this digital representation of a list, under the hood, away in the code, what you actually have in there is an array. So as I say, check out that other video if you have time. If not, don't worry, because in the next couple of videos, we're going to get a lot more practical. I'm going to show you what a real array looks like. I'm going to bring it to life a little bit, and then we're going to use that knowledge to go ahead and build a translation app as well. So tune into the next video, join me there. I'm going to show you first of all how to find APIs on an API discovery marketplace called Rapid API. And then once we've found that lecture translation app and understood how it works, we're going to dive in the third video into Retool. We're going to learn how the Retool platform works, and we're actually going to build a real translation app. So join me there, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.